if men are not led onto journeys of powerlessness, they will always abuse power. Transformation, initiation, getting the great vision can't happen inside of brick and mortar and asphalt. You always have to take the boy into nature. There's not a single exception to that. And whenever you've been in a situation, I'll bet you all have been, where only one thing matters, that's when new things happen. So initiation, first of all, is not a psychological paradigm at all. It's not about therapy. It's not about solving your problems with your father or your mother or how you were hurt. In fact, it just sort of leaps over those. Initiation is not a psychology, it's a cosmology. I'm going to use the word ownership. That what he's given is the inner authority to own his own life, to own his own experience, to own his own responsibility. When you don't have that, you have what we have today, this victimhood of blaming other people, this non-ownership of responsibility. It's always somebody else's fault. You can tell we're a massively uninitiated culture. Because basically, if you read the papers, it's mostly a blame game. Everybody saying who else is the cause for the evil in the world. Loving God, we thank you that we live at all. And we thank you that we live as men. We know that what it means to be a man is at least half of what it means to be like God. We pray that we can find the godly, good, beloved side of our own manhood and not be ashamed of it or afraid of it. We pray that we can be partners to our wives and our sisters and our girlfriends and all the women in our lives. We ask for this power. We ask for this gift. We ask for this freedom from the one who lived it first for us. We ask it in Jesus' name.
Amen. Amen.
Okay, what I'd like to talk to you about in this talk is about something that probably sounds very unusual, male initiation. And the reason it sounds unusual is because we've pretty much lost the custom in the West for 1,000 years now. And in that, we are an exception to every primal culture in the world. The initiation of the boy into manhood was deemed apparently absolutely necessary for cultural survival and for personal spirituality. And we don't do it. I think we thought we had the Christian sacraments of initiation, and if we get time, I'll refer to them, how the core idea is still there. But in many ways, they became so prettified, so churchified. I know those aren't words, but that the male stopped respecting them. They stopped having their initiating transformative effect. I want to, before I dive into it anymore, also relate to a new bit of knowledge that I've discovered that seems to verify this whole thing from another side. I've been reading a lot of research on the development of the brain. And this is just phenomenal material. It has huge implications for spirituality. And I'm going to very oversimplify it just to bring it to this point. That apparently there are 5 major brain surges while you're growing up. One in the whole first year of life, secondly around 4, then around 7, then around 11. But in a certain way, the most integrating one of all happens around 15. It continues in some form as late as 18, but there's this huge brain surge around 15. And what it does is try to connect all of the 4 brains together with the heart brain, which we now understand is real. And what they say, now mind you, these brain scientists have no interest in what I would call religion or spirituality. But they say that at that point, if a young man or young woman is not presented with a big vision and with a heroic person, we have the most massive dying off of brain cells. It's the greatest tragedy in the biology of the human person. Now I know why 2/3 of the cultures of the world initiated boys usually around 15. If they're not given, and try to think back yourself, brothers. Remember that idealism when you were a teenage boy? You just wanted to be great, be a part of something great. If you're not presented to true greatness, which Jesus would call the reign of God, a great big frame, a great big picture, a great big vision, you know what the typical male does? And the brain science affirms this. You just try to be a part of something loud, or a big marching army, or a big rock concert, or a stadium filled with 100,000 people and you're all waving together, which is all lovely stuff. But I would call it pseudo-transcendence. You feel this is greatness. Do you see? 100,000 men cheering for the Bengals can't be wrong. Well, actually, maybe they can. Huh? But the male psyche, I'm in the middle of history. Do you see what I mean? I'm in the middle of significance. It's probably why most men love to march with marching armies and marching bands. And why we like loud volume. For some reason, tremendously loud sound. I think the only time my own father ever, I don't think he ever yelled at me. I had such a good father. But I was about 15. I was helping him build our house. I had come home from the seminary that summer. And he was building us a new house himself. And I'm out doing something in the garage. And I turn on the radio full volume, And I can even remember the song, Volare, it was the song. And there's the flying boy, Volare, wants to fly, Oh, it's just so neat. I was having a brain surge, I'm sure, at 15. But my dad, who was trying to get work done and probably been working for months to get this house, and his son finally comes home and isn't much help, I'm sure. And he comes out the door and just yells at me, turn that damn radio down. And I'd never heard my dad yell at me like that. So of course, I quickly turned it down, But I realize now that's what I was doing. The seminary made me feel like I was a part of something great. Oh, I'm going to be a priest. I'm going to be significant. This many boys all being formed together is certainly moving towards something of importance. I come home in the summer. I can't really be a part of anything important except help my dad build a house. Now I would know that really was the important thing. So I turn Volare on full volume. So I just give you that I think we even have a brain foundation for the necessity of male initiation. And he says, when great vision and heroes are not presented, not rock stars, not people just driving fast cars or pseudo-heroes, but he says when that doesn't happen, what sets in is intense cynicism, that there is nothing great. There are no great people. And that cynicism quickly moves to violence. A lashing back at the world. Doesn't that explain the boys on the streets of all of our cities? They've been immensely let down by their fathers, their godfathers, their grandfathers, if they had any, and I would say by the church itself. So let me just unpackage a little bit. The most I can do here is give you a little hint. Some of you know that in the last 6-7 years, we've been giving these initiation rites up here at Ghost Ranch, where I've been trying to learn from this cross-cultural phenomenon and try to put it together in a way that would communicate the same messages and make sense to North American men who weren't initiated when they were 15. But now we find ourselves longing for it at 35 and even 55. And it was probably a presumptuous thing to do, but I knew we had to start somewhere. First thing, the boy is always separated from business as usual. Transformation, initiation, getting the great vision can't happen inside of brick and mortar and asphalt. You always have to take the boy into nature. There's not a single exception to that. It's only when he's in the middle of nature that he has to respect something that's bigger than he is. Right? This is natural greatness that he can't control, that he's in awe of. And he has to be left there normally, like we see in the vision quest of the Native Americans. He has to be left there long enough and quiet long enough. Almost always solitude and silence is of the essence, so he can observe the patterns of nature itself, of the animals, and start sinking back in to his solidarity with the universe. So initiation, first of all, is not a psychological paradigm at all. It's not about therapy. It's not about solving your problems with your father or your mother or how you were hurt. In fact, it just sort of leaps over those. Initiation is not a psychology, it's a cosmology. And that's why it transforms at such a deep level. It aligns the young man as a son of the universe, that he knows he belongs. Now, as a Christian, I'm absolutely convinced this is the exact meaning of Jesus' 40 days in the desert. But we didn't get it because we didn't know anything about initiation. And what he comes out with, if you remember, is a very, very simple message. I'm a beloved and I'm a son. That's all. That's enough. That's enough to change everything. And you can't just know that up here, of course. You have to know it down here in your belly and in your body and all the way through, that you're a beloved and you're a son. You're connected, and you're connected in a fortuitous, wonderful way. Not a dangerous way. Not a morbid way. And what we've done, it seems to me, I hope I'm not being too negative, but I got it from a Jewish friend recently who was talking to one of my nephews. And she said that, I don't mean to be disrespectful to you. She knew I was a Catholic priest. And she said, but as an outsider to Christianity, I try to understand it, and I try to observe it. And she says, what it seems to me is you Christians are always feeling guilty. And she says, I just don't get it. Help me understand. And I almost had to hear it from someone outside to recognize how true that is. That much of it is all sin-based, guilt-based, and shame people, make them feel afraid of God, make them feel they're going to get punished for their sins. And for some strange reason, we thought that was going to motivate people to love God. Initiation comes at it so much more positively. It's not moralistic at all. It totally does a sort of preemptive strike in terms of diving you into the beauty of the universe that you are a part of. And it knows that it can't teach you that merely in verbal form or by lectures like I'm doing now. This is clearly an inferior way of teaching, the lecture method. You have to send people so they experience it. And I think that's the only way men understand and feel respected by God. When God becomes their teacher and they know for themselves, and then you come along with your words and you simply, like a midwife, you pull out the child that has already been born within them. That teaching works. So initiation gave the primacy to nature, to solitude and silence, and all the discipline that went with that. And also a kind of expectation of something's going to happen. Creating the holy desire, creating the expectation. Something good's going to happen. And you know, for those of you who've been, it always does. I mean, I'm still amazed myself how it always does. But what I have to do the first 3 days, if you remember, is create what we call liminal space. Now, limina is a Latin word that means threshold. It's when you've left one room and you haven't entered the new room yet. Okay, you're in between spaces. And all transformation takes place in liminal space. All initiation takes place in liminal space. Liminal space is when all the extraneous things are taken away. And like was said in City Slickers, which was paradoxically filmed at Ghost Ranch, only one thing matters. Right? Now, whenever you've been in a situation, I'll bet you all have been, where only one thing matters, that's when new things happen. Maybe it was when you first found the death of a person that you were in love with, first discovered or heard of the death. For the next few days, you can think of nothing but that, everything. When it's one of your parents or your wife or a child, it goes on for years. It reframes the universe. That's liminal space. America was in liminal space for a couple months after September 11th. That's why there's so many stories. Because we saw everything. You got tired of hearing, maybe we still do, September 11th. Because only one frame explained anything and everything. I'll bet it happened to you as men the first time you fell in love as a teenage boy. That first great infatuation where all you can think of is this girl. Everything is seen in that light, and you'll see young boys just grow immensely during that period because they're in liminal space. Now, Mircea Eliade, who's done a lot of the greatest work on initiation, he says modern and postmodern people, which is what we are, we have very limited access to liminal space. We live almost 99% of our lives, now even more so because of the media, in profane space. Profane space is when there's no one thing that matters. There's just everything grabbing your attention every 3 minutes. And you live with a flypaper mind, just jumping around, solving this problem, solving that problem, fixing that, explaining that, controlling that. Nothing new will happen in that framework. So what you have to do is you have to pull the man out of business as usual, where he's living with his flypaper mind, or a flea jumping around, whatever image you want. You have to lead him away from that into a safe place where you say, in effect, only one thing matters the next few days. You have to take away his roles, his self-importance, so he can't be kissing up to those or protecting those or promoting those. In classic initiation, the boys all wore the same clothes, the same boring clothes, so you couldn't advertise your specialness or your difference. I'm just a man. And we're all naked underneath these clothes. There, it seems, was the readying so that the boy could receive the message. But inside of that was not just created the expectation of greatness or God, but inside of that, true eldering could happen. In fact, the boy was left alone and aimless, so he'd start longing for guidance. So he'd start longing for someone tell me what this means. Someone tell me what my life means. And after he'd waited long enough, we have to limit it to just a few days, but classic initiation went on weeks and months. When beginner's mind was created and the boy was teachable, then, when the student is ready, the teacher will arrive. Then authority could be represented. And there's no apologizing for wisdom inside of initiation. There's those who have been given the call or have the right to be teachers and to say to the men, here's what's real, here's what isn't real. And I send you out to believe it for yourself. So there's usually core central teachings. They're mostly about spirituality and sexuality, which is somehow the embodied world and the interior world, which is what the male is always trying to put together. He isn't that at home in the interior world, so he has to almost be forced there. And as I said before, usually the only thing strong enough to force him is pain. When it hurts so much, then he has to make sense out of it. And so you leave the boy so he can't keep running from his pain. So he can't keep running from his loneliness and his boredom and his silliness or his superficiality. And then can discover his inherent dignity. So you have to normally lead him. And these are the tests and ordeals that you've heard about, although we are very tame about it. but somehow you lead him outside of his comfort zone, to the edge of his usual resources that he relies upon. So he has to start calling upon some different resources. That's the key, right? Now, if you keep pandering to the ego, if you keep feeding him with drugs, sex, and rock and roll and noise and chatter and his usual roles and self-importance, nothing new is going to happen. So what you do in initiation, you take all that away. And I'm happy to say no one ever leaves. But you can see some guys want to. Because for a while, they're in naked nothingness. I don't know who I am here. I don't know how to define my superiority that I usually do, or my role. And that's exactly what has to happen. Then it's easy. Then God can so easily take over, and it always happens. Let me tell you again a little concrete story, just because people tend to remember visual images better than concepts like I'm giving you. This I watched on PBS, I think it was Nova, maybe, 3-4 years ago. Maybe some of you saw it. It was a story in Africa about this certain section in Africa where all these young elephants were sort of acting out of character. They were stomping on Volkswagens, which isn't typical elephant behavior, They were pushing over trees, not to eat, just to push over trees. And he said, why do these elephants do this? This isn't typical for elephants. And they even were killing other animals, which elephants normally don't do. So they had all these experts sent in to try to discover what has happened to the elephants of this particular area. Well, you've probably already figured it out. What had happened because of poaching and some disease is in that particular area, all of the old bull elephants had been killed or died. And what we had was a whole squadron of teenage boy elephants who had never been initiated, if I can use that term, never been mentored, and they were all violent and out of control. And they said they were really becoming neurotic. So in this Nova show, you see the helicopters bringing in, great big old bull elephants from other parts of Africa, and they put them down in this particular section. And then the cameras watch these old bull elephants. And when the young boys try to push over trees or stomp on Volkswagens, the old bull elephants just wave their ears, or make some kind of noise or raise their trunk. And the guy looks over, and apparently he gets the point. This is not the way elephants act. Well, I never knew it. You can almost see that on their face. In a matter of weeks, all the behavior changed. Now, the whole men's movement, Robert Bly says, started way back with a book by Alexander Mitscherlich, a German. And the book is entitled Society Without the Father. And he was trying to analyze his own German nation. When my book, The Wild Man, first came out in German, I was able to personally experience that. I was invited on a book tour, and I talked in every city to packed churches of young men from front to back, much bigger crowds than I would normally ever get in America. And one of the young boys stood up and said what Alexander Mitscherlich had said in his book. He said, Father, the reason we are here tonight, he says, we come from a nation that killed all of our grandfathers, our great-grandfathers, in the First World War. We were so in need of father figures that we created a negative father figure, because a negative one was better than none. We had to have someone tell us what to do, because we had no guidance. And then, because we chose a bad father figure, Adolf Hitler, all of our fathers were killed. And the room was just filled with tears. It was a cathedral, actually, of all these boys, because he was speaking for them. He said, we don't know our fathers, though many of us who do, they were Nazis. We were ashamed of them. They had nothing to teach us except militarism and materialism. And I said, that's all the American father has taught his kids too. Don't feel like you're much different. But that in a word, maybe a dramatic word, I think is what happens to history when boys are not taught what it means to be a man. It seems the male doesn't naturally get it. He really has to be taught because his natural instinct is to seek power. That's the elephant showing off his power. It's just testosterone gone wild. We use the term loose cannons. And if that power is not somehow channeled, it seems to almost always be destructive. And in effect, what I learned in my study of initiation is that if men are not led onto journeys of powerlessness, they will always abuse power. Now that seems like an overstatement, I know. But look at our country. Look at our heads of state. We can't find anybody beyond the teenage psyche. And they think this is a real world. What gives away the teenage psyche, by the way, is largely a dualistic worldview, of good guys and bad guys, where everything is framed in terms of win-lose. Every teenage boy thinks that way. That's the only way you can think before initiation is win-lose. Good guys, bad guys. And once the reality is framed that way, I can live inside of it. What an initiated man understands is that life can be framed in terms of win-win. That I don't have to always be on top to feel good about myself. I can partner life. I can partner women. I can partner other men. I don't always have to be number one. But that has to be taken out of a boy. He has to be taught that by being exposed, basically, to a greater power. So if this sounds anything like the 12-step program, don't be surprised, which I'm convinced is a work of the Spirit. And for those of you familiar with the 12-step program, which is one of the most successful spiritualities for men, I know, if not the most successful, it begins with that first step, to admit that you are powerless. And I've had people tell me that it takes them 5 years to do step number 1. Well, that's what initiation was about. Teaching you basically step number 1. To experience your own powerlessness so you'd be led to the edge of your own resources and plug back into what's really your power. We as believers would call God. They call the higher power, which is sort of an experience of immense abundance. That you can't be defeated anymore. That happiness and power are inside jobs and that you hold it inside of yourself. So I think we have our work cut out for us. I don't see this as being a bandwagon that everybody's going to jump on naturally. As I mentioned in passing, I think the church, the Judeo-Christian tradition, still has the remnants of all of this there. For example, Paul's theology of baptism, he says, do you not know? You were baptized into the death of Christ. It was clearly a symbolic drowning ceremony, going down into the water and symbolically dying. Every single initiation rite I've studied, the boy has to face on a gut level his own mortality. You are going to die, right? This life thing is only limited. It's only going to last for a few years. And you better get it right now. The word initiation gives away the bias. We were concerned about getting it right at the end, making an act of contrition 10 minutes before we died, or getting a priest an hour before we died, or making a deathbed confession. Initiation is much wiser. It says, let's get it right at the beginning. Initiation, and get the world framed correctly at the beginning. Know that it's just a school, and you're just here for a little while, and the elders and the father's role is to keep you from going down a lot of dead ends. You'll probably still make mistakes, but the great good news is that even these mistakes can be turned around, and that there's no final mistake at all, except not to stay on the journey. Maybe some of you are confirmed, like I was. We have now changed it. But I remember back somewhere in the mid-50s in Kansas when I was confirmed and the bishop came along. I'm kneeling there. I don't know if I had another little white suit on. But he comes along and lays his hand on my forehead, and then he slapped me on the cheek. And we were told this was to remind us that we were to be soldiers of Christ. We now know that that slap was a leftover from almost every initiation rite. In fact, I found right here in New Mexico that the Pueblo boys, when they are initiated in the kivas, are ritually whipped by the elders. Now, I know the secular humanist mind says, oh my God, this is child abuse, this is terrible. But inside of liminal space and inside of sacred space, you can do things completely different, and they have a completely different psychological meaning. It's exactly the opposite of abuse. Huh? It's not abuse at all. In fact, it's telling the boy on the body level, which is the only level he remembers and respects, that life is hard. And don't spend your whole life trying to make it easy for yourself. If you remember, those of you who read Scott Peck's Road Less Traveled, that's the very first line of the Road Less Traveled, which is the biggest selling book after the Bible of all time. And he starts by saying, life is difficult. And if you don't know that in your belly, what the male is going to do is he'll do everything he can to try to make life easy for himself, to seek perk and privilege and position. It's really amazing that it was all there. And then initiation always ended with a sumptuous banquet in which the boy was reminded of his adult status, his beloved status, his special status, his transformed status. He was the center of attention for days on end. That, I'm sure, is what the Christian Eucharist was supposed to be. A sumptuous, erotic banquet of rich food and intoxicating wine. But even there, at least in my church, we made the Mass into something that you could attend if you were worthy. Became back into the performance principle, back into attainment, and it lost all of the great transformative power of grace. Where our right to be there is precisely because we're unworthy. And God is our worthiness, not because we have attained or achieved any kind of worthiness. So the elements are still there. I'm hoping I can get some sacramental theologians to help me work on this and say, can we rediscover this in the Christian West? Is there a way of renaming this, re-ritualizing this in a way that males can respect? And thank God there's a lot of men that are willing and ready to work with me on that. And I invite you to the same thing. I think it's an immense task, but I can't think of a more important one. I was just, the beginning of the month, teaching in Brazil, and I'd been invited down there to teach the missionaries. And I said, well, what do you want the retreat to be on? And they said, on masculine spirituality. And I said, are you sure you want that? I said, because I knew there were going to be nuns there and lay missionaries, men and women, young married women and young unmarried women. I said, why would they want masculine spirituality? And they told me what we know is true in a lot of Latin America. They said, if there's one single problem in Brazil that is undercutting every effort and every attempt to renew things, it's the immature problem. Forgive me, I don't mean to put down any race, because I think we're all in this together. But they were working with Brazilians, and they said the single problem is the immense immaturity of the Brazilian male. That he lives life just drugs, sex, and rock and roll, in their opinion, and wants nothing more than that, and cannot be faithful to responsibility, to family, to children, to nonviolence. He's just trapped inside of a very small psyche. And as a Catholic, I couldn't help but think, this was one of the first countries that the Portuguese came over and supposedly evangelized, colonized. Churches on every corner, huge, sumptuous Catholic churches. where apparently the gospel has been preached for 300 to 400 years. And on the last day there, they took me to some of those churches, and there it was, right? Beautifully dressed statues, which only women would like to dress, I would think, And I think men get into dressing statues, normally. And the church is filled with sweet, loving old ladies, lighting candles, dressing statues, offering their prayers. God bless them. I'm sure they're holding us together, But again, I just wanted to weep. And the missionary said, see, here it is. This is our religion. This is our church. That it's a religion for women and a spirituality that men cannot respect and obviously have not profited from. So I give you that sort of tragic contemporary example, maybe to let you know, brothers, how urgent the need is. Again, as I told you before, our goal is long-term. The M.A.L.Es program, we're aiming for 5 generations from now. That we can just maybe get this started. Maybe some people can start talking about it. My hope this year is to finally put some of this down in writing. So pray that I can write a good book on male initiation that can honestly help people and not just be theoretical and be stuffed away on a bookshelf.